This is a Glassbox Media Podcast.
Welcome to another exciting episode of the Business of Sound. My name is David Segura, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Glassbox Media, and also, importantly, the humble host of this podcast. As always, our goal is to provide you with an inside look into the world of podcasting and give you actionable tips and strategies to help you make the most of your podcast endeavor. Every month, we talk to experts and we let them basically talk to us in exclusive interviews that are basically with the industry's leading voices. But before we get started, I wanted to ask you humbly to subscribe to the podcast. And if you have it in your heart, give us a 5-star rating because that makes it that much easier to discover all the latest and greatest from the business of sound. I'm really excited too, as well today, to introduce Scott Johnson, the host of What Was That Like? We are very flattered that we're actually a partner of Scott's here at Glassbox, and we've been able to do a lot of great things together. But it goes without saying, all the credit goes to him. Very excited for him to kind of delve into his show, explain what makes it special, and also explain like why he's been at it this long. In other words, Scott has actually been doing podcasting since 2012, and he launched this specific franchise in 2018. So I'm fascinated by his story, and I truly feel the audience will as well. So with that in mind, Scott, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Florida.
Oh yeah, I love being here. The Spotify studios are amazing.
Isn't it?
Yeah,
And
they're
that's
awesome.
something I failed to mention, but big shout out to our friends at Spotify. Scott knows this, but they've been amazing partners, frankly, to us both. And we're actually broadcasting here in their studio in beautiful Brooklyn, New York. And so it's an amazing spot that they make available to creators and podcast execs. And they've been very much a friend to the podcast community. I was going to say New York, but honestly, not even US, it's global. So amazing work. So with that in mind, Scott, I'm just kind of curious, just to hit you with it, like what led you to start What Was That Like?
Well, I had been podcasting since 2012 on a separate podcast, and I found that when I was listening to podcasts, the episodes that I really enjoyed are the ones where someone was telling a story, and even more so if it was a true story. And it's, there's a quote that people won't remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel. And I remember hearing a specific podcast episode from a friend of mine, and the story that he was telling was just so emotionally moving. And I thought, man, this is really powerful. And I want to do that. But I found that when I looked around, there weren't really any other shows doing it, at least not the way I would do it. So I already knew how to make a podcast. So I just said, okay, I'm going to do it myself. And that's where it started.
That's amazing. And for those of you that haven't listened to this content yet, I could tell you if you start listening, not only would I be pleased, but beyond that, there's 300 or 1,000 listeners every month that are tuning in, and that number's only going to grow from here. But Scott, I think one of the things that I think is really unique about your podcast is that a lot of times, at least in my opinion, you cover obviously very heavy subjects. Sometimes you were literally talking to people about maybe potentially the worst day in their life. Yet, when people ask me to kind of really describe it, I always say, in many ways, I feel it's inspirational. There's actually a very kind of positive, emotion that like comes from like listening to the content. I guess what made you choose the subject matter that you did, and how do you, I mean, not only conduct research, but sometimes kind of get through the interviews and the stories itself?
It's not always easy, really. When I first started, I made a list of people that I want to talk to, like somebody that was struck by lightning or somebody that survived a mass shooting or, stuff like that. And we don't cover not every episode is a really dark or tragedy or that kind of thing, but a lot of them are. And you're right. For a lot of these guests, it was the worst day in their life. And by telling that story on the show, they're kind of reliving it themselves, which can be difficult. I mean, I've had a lot of episodes where the guest is crying while they're telling the story. Wow. But to me, it's important not just to tell about that bad thing that happened, but also to have some kind of a positive, an end to it. And in a lot of cases, the guest has taken that tragedy and they've turned it into a mission
Mm-hmm.
or a cause. So they're really working, and that's why they want to come on and tell the story,
Mm-hmm.
is because they want to promote this particular cause. I had a guest who his son died of an asthma attack. It was a
Mm-hmm.
16-year-old son. And within 5 minutes of telling that story, this man was crying.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, he just lost his son.
Sure.
And when we recorded, it was only about 6 weeks after it happened.
Wow.
And I asked him specifically, I said, is it too soon? Maybe we should, give you some
Mm-hmm.
time a little bit. But no, he wanted to do it then because when his son passed away,
Mm-hmm.
his son was an organ donor.
Mm-hmm.
So by his death, he saved other people's lives.
Wow.
And so this man wanted to get the message out that to people to be an organ donor.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to find stories that are like that. So it's not just the tragedy, but it's
Mm-hmm.
also hope going forward.
Yeah, that's been the consistent arc that, we've certainly observed on the show. And, I guess one question people have is the production process, clearly how you research it. And I guess, how do you identify potential guests and relevant stories, for yourself and your audience?
Well, there's a few things that I
Mhm.
go through. I have a Facebook group with like almost 6,000 people in it, and so if I think a story is interesting,
Mhm.
that's one thing. But I want to make sure it's something my listeners want to hear. So I'll go in that group and take a poll, like say, I'm got a chance to interview this person. This is kind of what happened. Do you think you'd want to hear that?
Mhm.
And they either say yes or no, and that's one factor. But I try to picture my subscribers. You know how when you subscribe to a podcast and you see the new episodes, I kind of cherry pick. I don't listen to necessarily every episode of every show, but I want my listeners, when they're looking down their phones, looking at the new episodes, and they see a new episode that came up and they see the title,
Mhm.
I want that reaction to be, oh wow, okay, I got to hear that story.
Mhm.
And if that's the kind of response that
Mhm.
that title elicits, then I know it's going to be a good episode.
That makes sense. And so you're obviously looking for a hook to draw you, listeners in. You're going to provide them obviously with quality content, so no problem there. But do you also apply that same philosophy then to the show itself? Like, in other words, don't really know the answer to this or what you think is best practice, but is there very early on, once they do kind of like click to listen, is there a hook early on in the content to kind of keep them there? Or what's your overall thought process once you actually kind of get them there?
The very first hook is the
Mhm.
title of the episode.
Mhm.
And I title every episode the same way. It's the guest's name and what happened. It doesn't necessarily tell the whole story in the title, but when you see a title like Diana survived a plane crash,
Mhm.
or Whitney was shot 12 times, or Dan was mauled by a grizzly bear, that kind of gives you an idea of what you're in for. I do have content warnings sometimes on some of them if they involve certain types of topics. But yeah, that's kind of the hook. And my main thing is I don't want to make people wait to get to the story. That's one of my pet peeves on when I'm listening to podcasts is there's a lot of chatter or there's a lot of commercials or co-hosts talking, hey, what did you do this week, that kind of thing. I don't do any of that. We just want to get right to the story. And I'm always thinking when I'm interviewing a guest, I'm always thinking, okay, we've got to either they're in the middle of it and I'm just going to let them talk, or we've got to kind of steer it back to, if they go off on a tangent, we got to steer it back to the actual story because that's what people tuned in for.
Yeah, I think you're right. And, at the end of the day, I guess you got to respect that audience. Once you have a hook, you have a great topic to talk about, you got to trust that obviously they're going to stick around. But I think getting right into it, the reason I'm droning on about that is that there's a lot of folks in the audience, I promise you, that struggle with that. In other words, even on the commercial side, us being on the business end of things, we have to think really thoughtfully about, like, for example, how many pre-roll ads should run. Should they run near the top of the episode? Honestly, my short answer is yes, but I do think there is a risk that sometimes we underappreciate about maybe playing that before the host's voice. And at the end of the day, we don't want to do anything to kind of disrupt or annoy your basically dedicated fan base, which wants to hear directly from the host.
Right.
And so we get that. It's
Yeah,
tough, though.
absolutely. And I think a lot of that is on the host.
Mhm.
You've got to, if you're doing a host read ad, you've got to make it interesting. I was actually pleasantly surprised one time in my Facebook group. One of the listeners posted on their own that he said, It's funny. This podcast is one of the few where I don't fast forward through the ads.
Wow.
And other people comment and say, "Yeah, same here." And of course, I know some people do that.
Of course.
But as a host, I want to make the ads as
Mm-hmm.
interesting as well. They're not going to be quite as interesting as the story that we're
Sure.
hearing, but it should be enough that people don't mind hearing them.
Yeah, and you as like the star of your own show, but also acting, frankly, as the producer as well. You have to balance that, and there are commercial interests. So without going off on a long rant, I'll just say that it's funny. AVOD and fast channels, which means free and ad-supported channels, are really driving streaming right now. That's like kind of the hottest topic in media, and in a lot of ways, it's like back to the future. In other words, ads have always been like an integral part of the media creation process. So I think you hit the nail on the head. Easier said than done. Honestly, some hosts do struggle with that, and I don't mean that as even a critique. I just mean it's hard to balance like how do I basically, serve my commercial interest, but like position these folks as like patrons of the show so it feels more natural so that the audience is more likely to give them a chance. It's not easy. So I guess with that in mind, for that long, preamble, what advice do you have for hosts that are kind of struggling with that? Because just to add some more context, would-be partners or even early partners of Glassbox have asked us, frankly, for their advice. They're trying to strike the right balance, in their own words, sometimes trying not to quote-unquote sell out. And they want to do well, but at the same time, they want to kind of protect the user experience. Do you have any advice that maybe they can do to better manage that process?
I am very protective of my audience. So that's why I'm very picky about the stories that I do. There's certain types of stories that I just don't do. And yeah, I look at it like when I'm writing and or reading a host read ad, I want to put as much effort and perfectionism into that as I do in creating the episode itself, because I'm creating this episode and it's free for everybody, but in that ad, I'm being paid to do that.
Sure.
And the sponsor wants the absolute best read that they can get. And so I want something that sounds good, but also is effective, and that doesn't go on too long. There is a limit to what people will put up with as far as number of ads or the length of ads. So I'm trying to keep all of those things in mind, and then I read it the way I speak. Not everyone can do that. A lot of times it does sound like you're reading, but I want to write it so that when I read it, it sounds like I'm just talking, like I'm just ad-libbing. So if you can master that, that's an important thing, I think, too.
Great advice, and God, it'd be so much more useful if I could remember what I read. Literally, I kid you not, today. But there was someone in the podcast space, well respected, and like their argument was not only to obviously make it sound natural, authentic, which is harder than it sounds, but still obvious. But they were like, don't do that radio voice thing. In other words, if you sound like that, great, but try to keep it in the same tone, the same style as you do your content. You want people to know the difference, obviously, but he argued that if you're just looking at it from a purely performance perspective, it's better. And I have to admit, like, I'm a total amateur at this. I'm much more on like, the creator/business side, but I enjoy doing this podcast, and I find myself not even purposely doing it, trying to give spirited reads when I'm doing something, but transforming my voice in a way that people find kind of interesting, but I can tell just by the way they comment on it, they're like, that doesn't really sound like you. And so in the back of my mind, I'm like, okay, that's probably not a good thing then. But
yeah, it's a deliberate thing. You've got to make deliberate effort at it and be thinking about it, because you're right. When you're sitting here, you're reading something that you've written. There's a microphone in front of you. It seems almost instinctive to transform into that radio voice.
Yeah.
But you've just got to picture. I try to picture just sitting across from somebody, just talking about something. Something that I've used that I. That's if I'm reading a host read ad, that's something that I use and I know I can personally endorse.
Sure.
And if you would tell a friend about it, that's really all you're doing in the ad. It's just telling somebody about it.
Yeah, I think that says it all. I guess some of the other questions I have too, and I'm sure a lot of other folks in the audience do, not asking you to choose your favorite child essentially, but can you name a few of the more memorable or even some of your favorite episodes that you've done in the past?
Well, I would say that one of my real recent episodes, and I'm not going to give anything away about it, but just people can go look it up and listen to it. It's called Laura's Pain Became Her Purpose. Just read that. it is going to blow you away. I had so many people, so much feedback about that. And that's all I'm going to say about that one. Just go find it. But yeah, I love episodes that actually affect people, not just the guest, but the listeners as well. I had back real early, this was like one of the first 5 or 10 episodes, I talked with a man named Mark who he lives in Tampa. He's an attorney, and he donated his kidney to a stranger. And so he talked about that whole process and what it was like, and and he actually was able to meet the person, the recipient. And I've had people, this was 5 years ago now, and I still have people, sometimes, when a new listener discovers the show, a lot of times they'll go and download all the past episodes because this content it's evergreen,
sure.
it's timeless. And so they'll go back and they happen to listen to that episode about Mark donating his kidney. And sometimes people will email me and say, I heard this and I'm going to donate a kidney. Wow. And I mean, there's people saving other people's lives because of hearing this story.
Doesn't get much better than that.
Yeah.
Let me ask you though. So like, no one should need to justify like why doing something really good, especially saving someone's life. It doesn't require an explanation. But I have to admit, maybe that says more about me than it does anything else. Not family. It sounds like it's a stranger. What was that person's motivation to kind of step up and say, I mean, I can help. I'm going to donate my kidney?
Well, it's someone, Mark had thought about it in the past, but you know how a lot of times we'll think about doing something, that's a great thing. I should do that. I should really think about that someday. But there was a bulletin board in his office. He's an attorney in Tampa, and there's a bulletin board, and somebody, a friend of an employee or somebody had posted up saying, hey, this guy needs a kidney. And, a lot of people that are on the kidney waiting list are on dialysis, or there's not enough people donating, and they just end up dying. Wow. And so Mark saw that, and he knew he'd already thought about doing it at some point in the past, and he just decided to take action. He said, "Okay, I've thought about it. This is like a sign. This is my incentive. There's somebody here that needs it," and so he started investigating it. And it's a process. You may not be a match, but even if you're not a match to a particular person, you can donate to the waiting list and still save somebody's life. And that was what he decided to do.
Wow. It's amazing how something like that can happen, and you just have the resolve just to kind of like, step up immediately and get that done. So kudos out there to Mark, if he's out there listening.
Yeah.
I guess, another question I have too is that podcasting, as you know, is way more work than people think. From research to ideation to actually production, to editing, and then getting it out there, having it out in the world, a ton of work. But increasingly, seems like one of the trends that we're seeing here at Glassbox is that people, either the podcast hosts themselves or media companies, frankly, are trying to figure out how to adapt that content into different formats. So in plain English, we get this question a lot, including from some of our listeners here at Business of Sound. People want kind of like their host take on, is it worthwhile, or have you yourself considered doing live events, TV, book publishing? And especially with your background, I was kind of curious to see how you view that both in personal terms, but also as like a, industry development, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I know a lot of shows have done that successfully. It's not something that I've pursued yet, but I certainly would be open to it. These are stories that, you see on TV, shows about people who survived certain situations. This kind of story is something that people would gravitate to, and I've got over 150 of them. So yeah, I'd be absolutely open to something like that. I do, my podcast is audio only, but I do convert each one to a video to put on my YouTube channel just for discoverability, really.
Sure.
People are on there, and I don't really understand it, but a lot of people listen to podcasts on YouTube. It's not the way I consume stuff, but you got to kind of try to be everywhere.
Yeah, they have their fans, and they definitely do. Like for me personally, not to digress or get off topic, like I'll watch YouTube, including YouTube podcasts, but almost as like a replacement for TV. Part of the reason I love just audio podcasts is that, in theory, I can at least do multiple things at once. If something does move me or catch my attention, I'll stop. But that's the real appeal to podcasts for me. But the one thing that YouTube has taught everybody, because it's really growing like a weed, is that people are different, to each their own, and they're going to consume it how they like. And it's always fascinating to kind of think about that.
Yeah, it's easy to assume the way I consume content is the way everybody does, but Obviously, that's not true. So, yeah,
Hmm.
I think it's important.
I'd agree. So this is a little bit of a comment slash question, and it might put you on the spot some, but I'm gonna ask anyways.
Oh boy. Okay.
And here's the reason. Literally just a week ago, we were talking to like a friend of the company, Brandon. He used to work at Oxford Road. And so for the people out there in the listening audience, Oxford Road is one of the world's largest audio agencies. They represent an amazing array of brands from Indeed to many others. And there are a lot of the people that decide like basically what podcasts will grow and frankly they determine what brands will grow essentially since podcasts are so important. Anyways, to get to the point, Brandon started out his career in music and he's since moved on to basically take a lead role at a music agency and management company where obviously they're in the business of music. So one of their biggest revenue lines is tours. So just to get to the point, he really thinks that the future of, whatever you want to call it, live events or music is really increasingly going to be podcast host. And he says it's up to people like him to intelligently think what sort of arena or theater venue should we be booking in this city or that city. And so, in other words, maybe for some, it could be the Madison Square Garden. Maybe for others, it's the Hulu Theater at MSG. But the main point is that he really does believe in the power of like getting people assembled and kind of experiencing like a special show or a live show in front of everyone. So with that in mind, I have to tell you, like I was like super pumped to hear that. You're probably not that surprised to know that that was my reaction, but the way he described it and kind of some of the examples that he gave us, we were mind blown. So not a commitment. This is just like a brainstorm basically in real time.
Mhm.
But what are your thoughts about that? Like if it made sense for you, as a tour, like how would you feel about, literally playing to thousands of people doing what you do?
I don't know. I've got kind of mixed emotions
Mhm.
about that. I don't mind it at all.
Mhm.
Um, doing a story like this with a guest,
Mhm.
I don't know how the guest would feel about it.
It's
It
true.
kind of depends because, the people that I have on my show are not people who are normally interviewed.
Mhm.
They're not public speakers.
Mhm.
They just happen to have this one weird thing happen to them and they're telling that story.
Mhm.
So actually one of the selling points in my case is the fact that we don't even record them on video.
Mhm.
It's just, I mean, I can see the guest when we're
Sure.
speaking because I use Squadcast.
Mhm.
We can see each other, but only the audio is recorded.
Mhm.
So they don't have to worry about how they look. Half the time they're sitting in their closet
Mhm.
and you can see clothes behind them because that's what, for great
Yeah.
audio. So I don't know, bringing a person like that up on a stage and being in front of thousands of people and telling that story, especially one where it was a really traumatic thing for them to
Yeah.
talk about. I don't know. I'm open to it, but I don't know if it would work or
I
not.
get it. The way my mind works, I always explore things even if it doesn't end up making sense. I'm one of those people who thinks exploring things is a good use of time, no matter what the answer is. I think in your case, very special circumstances. And then on the second part, another special circumstance, like is a sensitivity to it. Do they want to? That's a big yes or no. And then the last part is, and I think you know this, whether they realize it or not, it's not easy. I don't exactly get stage fright, but I actually might if I was in front of 5,000 people talking about an intimate topic.
Hmm.
And while you're a trained media professional, most people aren't. And that's kind of honestly what makes, I think, your show so compelling. So the short answer is maybe, but, for what it's worth, I've been to one or two of these quote unquote concerts, like led by podcast hosts. And I just didn't get it at first. I just didn't wrap my mind around it. But after being there a few times, like, it's been amazing. It just works. I can't explain why, but I know it when I feel it, and it was amazing.
It does work, and
Mhm.
I think it especially works when the show has co-hosts.
Mhm.
People that can talk to each other rather than one singular host
Mhm.
having to carry the whole thing. I actually attended one of these last night here in town.
Oh, really? Which one?
Yeah, it was the podcast is called "Were You Raised by Wolves?"
Uh-huh.
And they did this live show. It's their first live show ever. They did it at the New York Comedy Club,
Oh,
and
nice.
the room was packed. The beginning, they said this is kind of an experiment. We didn't
Uh-huh.
like if we said if we're going to do this, is anybody even going to show up? But yeah, a lot of people showed up,
Uh-huh.
and it was great. And they brought on 3 comedians. They did their show format and everything, and it was the first live one they ever did, and it was a big success,
Wow.
from what I could tell. Anyway, I don't know that would be the
Yeah.
same for every podcast, but I'm like you. I'm certainly open to
Yeah.
investigating and exploring, what might work.
I'll take your word for it because, like, I know exactly where that is. Greenwich Village. It's iconic. It's a cool place, but not easy. And what I mean by that is that apart from just like being on stage, the audience is generally cool, but it's still New York. And if they don't like something, unfortunately, I will tell you, for those listening and wondering, are there stereotypes about New York true? Kinda. They can be tough crowds. And so if something isn't going right, they're going to let you know. They definitely appreciate, I think, like the audience there is actually a lot of working actors and comedians that actually attend. But I've been to a few of those shows, and I've seen kind of what happens when just something doesn't work. You try it, that's the nature of the job, but when you bomb, it's not like tomatoes or rotten fruit or anything like that, but it's not so good. And
Yeah.
that's tough sometimes. But I think if they made that work in an environment like that, I think like theaters and other places might be that much easier.
Yeah, and it was obvious at that show, the one I went to last night, that most of the audience were already fans of that podcast. So it was a very friendly environment. They're not going to, be angry if something doesn't work
Right,
or
right.
if a joke flops or something like that.
That's a
So
good
it's
point.
kind of funny too. When I'm recording,
Hmm.
I know logically in my head, okay, what I'm saying right now is going to be heard by
Hmm.
300,000, 400,000 people. And if I was in front of hundreds of thousands of people, I'd be a lot more nervous.
Hmm.
But I know when I'm recording, if I screw up, I can say, okay, scratch that, I'm going to start over again. And so I don't feel any nerves at all. Plus, I've got really complete notes in front of me
Sure.
of the person's story so that I can kind of steer the conversation and that kind of thing. But yeah, being in a live environment, that's kind of a different thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. That's amazing. I guess with that in mind too, as we move to wrap up, just wanted to open it back to you. Is there anything that maybe we didn't cover that you'd love to share with the audience?
Yeah. As far as like stuff going forward, projects and plans, I kind of look at every episode as a new project and a plan that needs to be exciting. That's one of my filters is it going to be a really interesting thing for the listeners to hear? But one thing that I'm kind of planning, and I've done this once a while ago, but collaborating with another host and with the listeners. Like if there's another storytelling podcast and we can get together and create a Zoom call and invite all the listeners of both shows to attend, that kind of there's a crossover and people find out one show, they find out about the other one, and both of us promoted on our shows. I think that could be a big thing, and it doesn't cost anything.
I'd agree. Doing even more of those is something that we definitely want to encourage. I think there's obviously ways that we can be helpful, and it's ironic, but like the easiest way to grow a podcast, never easy actually, but the best way is other podcasts. And that's something that we've seen consistently in Glassbox. We've experimented with a lot of other tactics, but consistently and ironically enough, unpaid kind of trades, barters, doing things of value for each other, not just with Glassbox podcasts, as you know, but honestly, even our so-called competitors. We're at a stage, I think, in the podcast industry where people honestly genuinely want to help. And I think the thought process is it's not really zero sum. We don't have to succeed and thereby Pushkin or something fail. Basically, all of us can lift each other's boats. So love to hear that. That works and it's consistent.
That's the way I see it too. It's kind of funny. In most businesses, you think other shows would be competitors because you can only listen to one show at a time, right? But I mean, look at your podcast list, your podcast playlist. There's a bunch of shows on there,
Of course.
and I don't know what the statistics are now, but half the country doesn't even listen to a podcast regularly yet. There's so much room for growth. Maybe it's not half. It might be less than that. But I think anytime I see other podcasts or other hosts as collaborators, not competitors. And I think it's something that's wonderful about this industry.
No, I'd agree with that. Even on a kind of unrelated but related anecdote, tonight, we're co-hosting an event with our friends at Podfest. They're doing kind of like a pop-up event in different cities, including now in New York, where normally they do everything in Orlando. So long story short, great people, and we're going to have an amazing amount of like podcasters in there. Some of them are affiliated with companies like Paramount, for example. Some of them are independent podcasters that have no formal business relationship with Glassbox, but it's a community effort. And I've been very pleasantly surprised since we started this company at how basically cooperative everyone is in the podcasting industry. And I'm comparing that to some of my other activities or investments both now and in the past, including TV and video. Definitely not the case. So it's been a nice change of pace. I'll put it that
a
way.
refreshing surprise, huh?
Yeah, seriously. Refreshing is the operative word. But with that in mind, Scott, I just want to thank you again for taking the time. And I'm sure the audience is going to get a lot from this episode. As always, based on the questions we get, we'll be sure to pass that on to you. We'll share some of that feedback regardless, whether they're questions or not, and we'll go from there.
Absolutely. And I just want to say, working with Glassbox has been wonderful. You guys are great, collaborative, and helpful in getting promoting the show, growing it. It's just been a 100% positive experience.
Thank you. We appreciate that so much, and we've enjoyed working with you as well, but always looking to do more. So hopefully that'll come to pass more in the future.
Yeah.
Thank you. With that in mind, just want to thank the audience again for listening to this week's episode of The Business of Sound. As always, this show is produced by Erica Miranda, and new episodes will be released at least once every Thursday a month, and if not, usually twice. And again, we humbly ask you to consider leaving us a 5-star review and to subscribe to the show, but that choice is obviously yours. And we also ask you to follow Glassbox Media on both Instagram and LinkedIn to get information not only about this podcast, but the company. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.